So it's mid-November now in the Grow Paradise garden, and last night was the first time we had a frost. It's the first frost of the season. It dropped down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which for me is relatively cold at this time of year. Now I know that sounds like nothing for those viewers that are in places like Canada that get really severely cold winters, but here, relative to the rest of the season, that's quite cold, and I've really pushed the boundaries of how long I can leave plants like this outside, enjoying these tropical style flowers. But it's now time to move them into the greenhouse, which is a shame. The bees are enjoying these blooms, but I really want to protect them so that they get bigger, ready for next season. And I want to propagate these plants as well, so I've got lots of plants to share over the coming months. But these aren't the only flowers that are still looking great at this time of year. And I've actually got quite a lot of plants that I can leave out that are providing lots of rich nectar containing flowers that are really inviting bees and other pollinators into the garden, even as we're approaching winter. So I'm going to give you a quick look around what's still in flower and is feeding the passing wildlife, and then I'll start to overwinter some plants and probably get some propagation done as well. Now these Buton look surprisingly tropical, but they actually tolerate temperatures down to 5 degrees Celsius with ease, and I found that they'll drop down to 0 and tolerate light frosts really well. Now the microclimate in our garden didn't see too much ice, but out in the open areas of the car park, just the other side of our fence, all the cars were covered in ice this morning, but it shows the benefits that a microclimate has if you can create one in your garden. It means that so many plants will last just that bit longer, and us gardeners can enjoy them, and we're going to be able to provide rich, nectar-rich flowers for bees, wasps, other pollinators for a much longer part of the season. You can see there's another Brugmansia at the back there as well, a double flowering one. So you've got one skirt inside of another. We've really been lucky, I think, this year to enjoy so many tropical looking flowers, so much colour, so late into the year. Now, that's not the only flowers that we've still got. Despite the colder temperatures, we've still got fuchsia in bloom. We've got Salvia amistad, which is having its second or third flush of flowers because this was chopped right back for propagation. You can see a honeybee there, I think that's a honeybee, just flying around as we speak. Now, that climber on the back of the wall I showed you in the last video is covered in buds ready for flowers. They're still not quite opening up, but there's clusters of these flowers all the way along. 3 layers we've trained across this wall, so that's going to replace a food source as I'm taking these Brugmansia away and protecting them in a frost-free greenhouse for winter. I've actually found the Brugmansia will tolerate temperatures as low as 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, just kept frost-free and dry through winter. And it sorts of forces them into semi-dormancy. Now, massive bumblebee flying past the camera for effect then. We've also got these. This is my Fatsia japonica variegata with the mottled leaf edges. And this is an ivy relative. So if you're out for walks in the woods, English ivy that climbs all over the ground of forests, up the trees, is also in flower now. And the flowers resemble the flowers of Fatsia a lot, and you can tell that they're related. And bees love this. Now I've noticed that when it's in the shade like it is now, it's not covered quite so much. But when the sun shines on these clusters of tiny white flowers, the bees absolutely cover them. They love it. Now, overwintering plants sometimes means having to sacrifice the blooms that you've been enjoying outside for as long as possible. And that really is the case with these Brugmansias. Although they're looking good, a lot of the flowers are quite mottled now, so it's time for me to chop them off, chop up the stems, which is going to shrink the plant to a much more manageable size so that I can overwinter them and grow them in the greenhouse through winter. In a more compact form, because in my 6-foot by 8-foot greenhouse, I don't have a massive greenhouse. Trying to overwinter plants of this size just isn't going to happen, so I have to chop them back each year, but it's fine. I love propagating, and Brugmansias are so easy to grow from stem cuttings, so I'll show you how. Now this display behind me is actually made up of 2 separate plants. 2 stems that I'm hoping will form nice established trunks in the years to come. Reach a sensible height, they branch out, and when Brugmansia branch out, that's when you get these flowers forming. But I don't need these flowers at this stage, so I'm going to chop them off and put them away. Now you'll notice that bare hands. Brugmansia are poisonous. It's one of the most poisonous plants in the garden. People get really scared of growing these plants for that reason. And to be honest, foxgloves and tomatoes are exactly the same. Or tomato leaves, I should say. We obviously eat the fruit of tomatoes, and Brugmansia are tomato relatives. So there's a lot of plants that we grow that are highly, highly poisonous, but we're not growing them to eat them. That's the key thing you need to remember. And obviously, if you handle them, just wash your hands thoroughly and you'll be absolutely fine. I've been growing these plants for years, and I've never had, oh, there's a seed pod there, never had that before. I've never had any issue growing them. It's just being sensible. Wash your hands, don't touch your eyes when you're handling them, and when you're watering, make sure the water doesn't run off the leaves into your eyes, because it can cause your pupils to dilate and all sorts of effects like temporary sight loss. But as I say, I've not experienced these problems just because I'm taking sensible measures. Now you'll notice that I'm also chopping off the leaves. I'm doing that because as I'm taking cuttings, reducing the number of leaves on the stem is going to reduce the rate at which water is lost, which means our cutting material is not going to dry out and die before it's had a chance to grow its own roots. There we go. Now this front stem, I'm literally going to just cut like that, and I'll probably chop this into probably 3 sections ready for rooting as a cutting. Now the first is just like that. I've got foliage there at the top and the bottom ready for roots. Do one more there, one more and another. I'll probably ditch the lower leaves on this one. Even that is too many leaves. You want to reduce that number right back. If you've got a big leaf, you can cut it in half. That's going to reduce the amount of water that's lost, but it leaves enough surface area for this leaf to photosynthesize to produce sugars that's going to fuel the growth of root cells at the bottom half of the plant. So I'll do the same here. Obviously, these leaves are enormous, so cut that back. Just cutting lots off. And that's ready for sticking in a glass of water. Now I'm just going to carry on doing this on both plants until I've got a nice clear stem where I can lift the pot, carry it into the greenhouse and keep it frost-free for winter. Now things I would remember when I'm growing Brugmansia, tips I'd like to share really, is keep them really well fed. I've been growing these for a number of years and they really are the hungriest plants I've ever grown. I feed them liquid tomato feed, maybe twice a week, especially in periods where they're growing really, really actively. So in summer, definitely twice a week. We're going to water them every single day. They're very thirsty plants. They've got so much leaf surface and they're producing such big flowers. Water is the conduit, the substance that they move all of that food that you're giving them around with. So it needs a lot of water to carry all of that food to the parts of the plants that need it. Especially if you're growing them in containers like I've got here. Growing them in containers means that that root zone isn't going to be massive. It's not going to get its roots down into the soil if you've planted them out in the bed. So that pot is going to be susceptible to drying out really, really quickly. You can sit them in a tray of water. That also really helps. They seem to have no issue at all with having their roots sat in water during the warm months of summer. I'll remove these snails now before I accidentally carry them into the greenhouse. Now here's all of our cuttings prepared and ready to stick in jars of water where they'll quickly form roots. I'll keep these on a windowsill indoors. Our house is at maybe 18 to 20 degrees Celsius and they're going to grow roots within a couple of weeks. They root very, very quickly and they can stay in these glass jars as rooted cuttings right through until next spring, when we can pop them out when they're ready to grow on. I like using these tall coffee jars as well. Tall jars are great for cuttings like this because it lets lots of roots form, and the cutting's not going to fall over if we get some new top growth. Just placing them in like that. Now, the more nodes that you've got underwater, nodes are the parts where you can see growth happening from the stem, the more chances there are, the more places there are that the stem's going to produce roots as well. Didn't need that one. And these are ready to root now. You can see now the difference. The plant behind me hasn't been prepared. It's absolutely covered in flowers and foliage and is way too big to go into the greenhouse, even though it needs to, so it's going to get the same treatment as this one, which has been stripped right back to the central stem, which preserves the height I want it to be starting from next year. And I've left this Y formation because in Brugmansia, when you get the Y formation, the split in the stem, that's when flowers are going to start. So I'm hoping that by leaving that, the new growth next year will flower much sooner. So I'll get a good flush early in the year and then maybe a couple as the season rolls by as well. Now, I grow Brugmansia in pots. This is actually just a decorative ceramic pot. I grow them in these big plastic containers. And I like to use a nice thick plastic so that I can reuse it year after year rather than just having to throw away broken plastic all the time. And plastic's great. It's lightweight, so no matter how big this gets, it's manageable. I can carry it to the greenhouse when I need to, and I can move it around the garden when the display is looking good. And it's also really easy to pick off any hitchhikers. So we've got a little snail there. I'm just going to make sure as many of them are off, that's looking pretty clean, before I carry it to the greenhouse, because we work so hard to keep our greenhouse pest-free. We don't use pesticides in the Grow Paradise garden or on the nursery. So it's all about kind of physical prevention, removing them by hand, and just keeping the population controlled using methods like inviting the native wildlife in. So we've got the bees that bring the birds, and then the birds will pick the worms, the snails, the aphids, everything off of the plants, and it keeps a good natural balance in our garden. But let's go put this in the greenhouse now. Now, the trick with overwintering container-grown Brugmansia is, now we've reduced pretty much all of the leaves to nothing, is just to let the roots dry out, and I will water them maybe once every couple of weeks, maybe once a month, depending how cold the greenhouse gets. Because now this plant isn't actively growing, now there's no leaves where the water's going to be transpiring out of, the roots aren't going to be uptaking water as much. So if I keep this root zone soaking wet, it's just going to rot. So keeping it on the drier side without leaves sort of tricks it into a semi-dormant state. We keep it just moist enough that it doesn't dry out and die. And then when spring comes next year, I'll see new leaves starting to form where it's trying to grow. That's my cue to start watering with lots of feed. As I say, they're hungry plants, and then it will grow and we'll get that same stunning display again next year. Now, to keep it dry in the greenhouse, I just keep it away from under the benches, because anything I water, the water's going to drip down and get it wet, and I really don't want it to be wet. So I normally keep it in the central walkway where I can just easily move them out of the way if I need space to do any bigger jobs. Now, any other tender plants that I've got growing outside, now is the time I'm going to start moving them into the greenhouse. So the same goes for this Spanish moss, this air plant. Although I've had them survive outside, a small bit there, I'll leave that. Although I've had them survive outside before, I like to keep a couple of good clumps in good health for propagation on the nursery so I can get my own homegrown plants. So these will be coming into the greenhouse too, where I've hung cables. I'm currently drying more cloths, and they just hang like that. This clump is the one that stayed outside in 0 degrees Celsius last year, and it survived absolutely fine. So I'm going to leave it there. I think it's a really good microclimate underneath the evergreen leaves. of this cherry laurel. But I do have more tender bromeliads that have been growing as epiphytes on this tree. So they need to be unhooked and brought into the greenhouse too. I'm just going to tip those out because they often collect water, but it's been quite dry here. So that one's dry. And they're just going to hang off the same wire. I've made a lot of videos about growing bromeliads this way in the UK. I think it's such a good way to make standard plants, something like this laurel, look really, really tropical. Just flashes of colour. You don't expect to see it in a garden somewhere like this. And they really don't take much work. Once they're hung out, I don't do a thing. They don't need any water. They catch their own rainwater in this central rosette. And then I just hang them at the top of the greenhouse. There's one. And there's the other. Now the only thing you need to remember is where you put them in spring so that you can go and get them all in before the cold comes. To be honest, I'm a little bit late this year. Snails do like to hide in them though. Just put them there for the time being. I'll find space. Now that it's a nice bright sunny day, which has been quite rare actually this November, everything that I'm trying to dry in here is dried, so I can turn the wires on the roofs back into a space to hang bromeliads and other epiphytic plants off of. Now that's the first of quite a few plants that are going to be overwintering and propagating, and I just wanted to share with you an update. Like I say, the garden nighttime temperatures are now getting frosty, but the daytimes are maybe outside up to about 15 degrees Celsius. In the greenhouse, it's lovely. Shut the door and we get up to the mid-20s, which is why it's so nice. If you've got a space like this to work, just come out here and enjoy it. It's your own escape. I'll probably do a video about my insulation next, so that you know how I'm saving money, keeping the greenhouse warm, which means that I can keep growing through winter, keep propagating, just keep enjoying this hobby for as much of the year as possible. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.